Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Generals 0 Hour for PC and Mac. This is the expansion pack to Command & Conquer Generals, and oddly enough was actually released the exact same year, and more specifically it was released about 5 months later in September. So it's kind of weird that this thing turned around so quickly, and on top of that it got a very, very good reception. I mean, people generally enjoyed Command & Conquer Generals by itself, but then 0 Hour came out, and that just expanded upon things, changed up a few things here and there, and it seems to be what kind of made it a classic in a lot of people's eyes. Now, if you've seen my review of Command & Conquer Generals, I do mention in that there's only one issue with Generals, and that is that 0 Hour makes it better. But not only that, it basically made playing the base game by itself pointless. So, what is it about 0 Hour that makes this thing really a must-have if you're going to play Command & Conquer Generals? What does it add to the table to actually shake things up? And just how is it as an expansion pack in general, considering it came out 5 months later? Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really nothing to say about it. It's exactly the same as the base game. It's just that they added in some new units and things like that, and all of that's up to spec. So the real question here is, what about the story and the gameplay? Well, as far as the story goes, it picks up where the original game left off and basically just continues the whole campaign of the US and China against the GLA. And it actually chronologically starts with the US campaign, then goes to the GLA campaign, and then finally the Chinese campaign. But regardless, it's a pretty ridiculous plot that is ultimately not particularly strong. And what ends up happening throughout the course of the game is that the GLA mounts attacks on the US and China, and the US and China go and retaliate and try to eradicate the GLA. There's not much more to say than that, really. There are a few characters here and there that do get some additional characterization, but ultimately it's all played down pretty considerably, and once again, this thing does not feel like a Command & Conquer game at all. But what 0 Hour does is change things up from even Command & Conquer Generals. See, part of the problem with Generals is that it's a pretty standard RTS all around. It doesn't really do anything that was all that different from what most other RTSs of the time were doing, other than its general idea, which wasn't really expanded upon all that much in the original game. It was just kind of a bunch of abilities that you would unlock over time. And other than that, it was just a fairly straightforward RTS with 3 factions that play pretty wildly differently. At least the GLA plays completely differently from the US and Chinese factions, whereas the US and Chinese factions had fairly similar playstyles, but China relying a lot more on horde tactics, whereas the US relies more on just individual units of overwhelming power and high-tech stuff. And of course that continues with 0 Hour, but here's the thing. 0 Hour is where this game actually sets itself apart from the other Command & Conquer games, as well as other strategy games out there. This time they actually take the title, Generals, and implement it. You now have multiple generals per faction. For example, the US has 3 generals that get different sets of units and technologies and such like that are tailored to more specific playstyles, and they each get their own bonuses and detriments to the faction based on that playstyle. For example, you can pick General Alexis Alexander, who is focused entirely on super weapons. And so what you can do with her is you can get the particle cannon for half price, among many other things. She's a lot more defensive of a general than what you're used to if you're playing as the US faction. And then there's another general who is focused on aircraft. So pretty much everything you do with him is going to be focused entirely on air superiority. And then lastly, there is a general based on laser weapons. So he gets a bunch of units that are outfitted with actual laser weapons as opposed to just normal ballistic weapons and things like that, and various bonuses related to that. And of course, the other two factions each have 3 generals of their own to tailor those to different playstyles as well, creating a large swath of differing playstyles depending on what you feel like doing. If you want to go for the more super weapon stuff, you can. If you want to be more infantry focused, that's perfectly fine. Want to be more armor focused? Sure, go right ahead. There is a general out there with your specific playstyle just set up right from the get-go. And that in and of itself is interesting and actually lends credence to the name Command and Conquer Generals, because now you actually have generals to choose from, and it's about generals. They also add in a Generals Challenge mode, where you pick one of these generals, just whatever faction you want, and then you go through a gauntlet. And this gauntlet is basically you up against every other general in the game, and eventually you get to the boss general, which is General Liang, who has access to literally everything from every faction. And it's frankly kind of insanely hard. Now, with the original generals, I was actually able to play this thing against hard and brutal AIs without too horribly much difficulty. It doesn't really suit my playstyle per se, because Command & Conquer has always been very rush heavy, and that is something that did not really change with generals, I have to admit. But I'm not really suited to the rush playstyle kind of stuff. I can do it if I have to, but it's not really where I get my kicks in RTS. And Zero Hour takes that and runs with it. You're going to be dealing with huge hordes of enemies very quickly, even on normal difficulty. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Zero Hour actually does ratchet up the difficulty a fairly significant degree, in addition to adding all of this content and just changing up the factions to have not only your baseline, which is what you'd basically be used to if you played Generals by itself, but also to have these much more specific playstyles, which individually can be a lot more powerful if you know how to use them than just the baseline faction. Now, that's not to say that the baseline factions are irrelevant anymore. They're still very, very solid, and if you know what to do with them, you're going to do just fine. But, again, those generals really do narrow down the playstyles into what people were basically doing with the various factions in baseline generals anyway. Only now there's actual playstyles that are built into the game and are specifically tailored for that. So it expands the strategic possibilities with it from not a heck of a lot in the original Generals to a fair amount in Zero Hour. And each of these generals actually does play pretty wildly differently from one another, even though they might be on the same factions. And that is something that is really interesting to see, that they were willing to just shake the gameplay up that considerably just by introducing a simple mechanic like generals. So even though the campaigns aren't particularly great, they're just kind of standard RTS fare for the most part, and even though the difficulty can be kind of ridiculous at times if you don't really have your playstyle nailed down, General Zero Hour is really the way to play Command & Conquer Generals. If you don't have Zero Hour and you're just playing baseline Command & Conquer Generals, it's a pretty good game. Zero Hour is what takes it from being a pretty good but fairly standard RTS for its time, and ratchets it up to a level where I can actually see where people are calling it a sort of modern classic. It sets itself apart from pretty much every other RTS out there for its time. There is one really nasty problem, though. It has aged fairly considerably. You do need to get past that. And most of the same problems that baseline Generals had, Zero Hour still has. It now feels like its own unique entity, but it still doesn't feel like a Command & Conquer game. And it's still, for the most part, as far as its mechanics go, a fairly standard RTS. So you might have to overcome those problems in order to really get the most out of Generals and General Zero Hour, but ultimately Zero Hour itself is a very good expansion pack. It adds a lot of content, and not just new units to throw around in the battle and say, oh, well, that's good enough, right? No. You got a whole new mode to play. You got whole new campaigns. You got numerous ways to actually play your factions now, in addition to having the new stuff. And it still maintains that level of absolute ridiculousness that baseline generals had. To give you an example, one of the things they put into 0 Hour is actually something they planned for the original generals, but they just didn't put it in. And that is new shoes for the workers that the GLA gets. So all of that complaining about, can I have new shoes in the original generals? It now gets solved with the worker shoes in 0 Hour. And that's only one example. There's tons of stuff like that in this game. It is absurd. It is not meant to be taken very seriously. And it's just a lot of fun. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.